Right, well, it is 1:30, so I do want to welcome our attendees and thank you for taking time today to join the Pandemic Programming Insights and Information for Today and What's Next, sponsored by both the Alliance for Regional Development and the Chicago Central Area Committee. I'm Kelly O'Brien, and if you're not familiar with the Alliance, it is an organization that covers the Milwaukee, Chicagoland, Northwest Indiana corridor. It was created in 2012 to really promote cross-jurisdictional collaboration. The sister organization, the Chicago Central Area Committee, is a 65-year-old civic group focused on the planning and development of Chicago. DePaul has been a legacy member, and we are very grateful for the support we have received and continue to receive. For our audience members, please note that on the bottom of the screen, there is a Q&A button. So following Dr. Mockaitis' presentation, we will be able to get to your questions. So as the presentation is happening, please feel free to submit those questions and we will get to them as soon as we can. I'd like to really begin by saying that back in March, when we first really started hearing about COVID, I read an article that Dr. Mockaitis published in The Hill, which is a publication I've been reading since my days in college in Washington, D.C. And it really caught my attention. It was titled, "What We Can Learn from Past Pandemics." And as this series has unfolded, it has remained in the back of my mind that we really should learn lessons from history. So I was just thrilled when Dr. Mockaitis had agreed to be a keynote speaker today. So a little bit of background. He is a professor of history at DePaul University, where he teaches courses in world and European history. He earned his BA in European History from Allegheny College and his MA and PhD in Modern British and Irish History from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And of course, that's great because, as I mentioned, Wisconsin is part of the footprint of the Alliance. And you can imagine, as a girl with a name like Kelly O'Brien, I have an affinity for Irish history. That being said, he has written 8 books and numerous articles. His latest book, which I highly recommend, Violent Extremists, Understanding the Domestic and International Terrorist Threat, which was just published this time last year in June of 2019. Dr. Mockaitis is a frequent commentator on terrorism and security matters, and he's appeared on public television, National Public Radio, BBC World News, and all major Chicago TV stations, as well as numerous radio programs. He's the recipient of many awards, and as I mentioned, he is a regular contributor to The Hill. So we are just thrilled to have somebody with such outstanding credentials. Dr. Mockaitis, thank you for joining us today.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me.
So you are an expert in pandemics or the history of pandemics. And I think it would be interesting to maybe put things in perspective. Maybe you can start by helping us understand maybe the top 4 or 5 historic pandemics where we've kind of dealt with diseases of this scale.
Okay, let me kind of show you a graphic here. You disabled screen sharing, I'm afraid.
Let me just get that fixed.
But anyway, I can start by saying diseases, pandemic diseases are ironically a product of human civilization. We don't tend to get them, you don't tend to see them in hunter-gatherer societies. Certainly our ancestors had to deal with them. But when they lived in small communities isolated from one another, there was very little opportunity to share infection. That changed when people began living in cities about 10,000 years ago, and changed dramatically when they began trading locally at first and then over wide areas regionally and ultimately globally. So we then began to see the spread of epidemic and pandemic diseases. In the 6th century, in the Eastern Roman Empire, it came to be known the Byzantine Empire, the plague of Justinian, which probably began in Egypt and came by grain ships to Constantinople, spread across Europe. At its height, they estimate it killed 5,000 people a day in the capital of Constantinople, which today is Istanbul, and may have killed as many as half the population of Europe. Of course, everybody is pretty familiar, at least in its outline, with the infamous Black Death, the bubonic plague, which, like Justinian's plague, was Yersinia pestis, a plague bacteria that hits Europe in 1347, beginning in Sicily and brought there from the Black Sea region, probably further east from Central Asia. And in the span of about 2 years, killed anywhere from a third to half the population of Europe. Smallpox, in addition to to pandemics, we've lived with endemic diseases for most of our history. One of which is smallpox, which until very recently, in the last century, really, up to the 19th century, killed people on a regular basis. It produced pockmarks, and if you had no immunity, you could die quickly. Ironically, the people who didn't get infected were dairy farmers and milkmaids, because they got cowpox, which is a variant of the disease, and that kind of inadvertently inoculated them from the more serious outbreak. And from that, in the 18th century, people learned how to develop the first vaccines. The most devastating kill-off from smallpox and other communicable diseases was, of course, among the native population of the Americas, that lost between 90 and 95% of their populations in about a century after 1492, because they had no immunity to these European diseases. Asiatic cholera came to Europe in the 19th century and appeared regularly in crowded, unsanitary urban environments. It's a waterborne intestinal infection that was a serious problem until people began to improve conditions and develop treatments and whatnot. So that kind of gives you a view. And then, of course, flu has been around a long time. And the one we're here to talk about today is the 1918 to 19 influenza pandemic, which was the most deadly outbreak of disease in American history.
Well, and before we leave the history, one tidbit that I found really interesting in your article is maybe you can share with the audience. How did the word quarantine come to be?
Well, that's sort of interesting, is that the one thing that has worked in almost every pandemic, even before the invention of modern medicine, was people understood that isolating yourself from infected people actually worked. So what the government of Venice, which controlled the city of Ragusa, which is in fact Dubrovnik. If you're not familiar with Dubrovnik, Croatia, you may have seen it as one of the filming locations for Game of Thrones. But in any case, they decided that any ship coming into the port, its crew would have to remain isolated from coming into the city for a period of 40 days, from which the Italian word for 40, what we get is quarantine, which was a means of keeping people isolated. So, and ironically, plague had something like a 30-day infection period, so it actually did have some effect. But it's amazing how quickly and early people discovered that they learned to stay away from people who were infected, and that does reduce the spread of disease then as now.
Thank you. So now, when did the 1819 pandemic actually start? If I understand correctly, was it in March of 2018?
It was actually, it did begin in earlier than that, actually. We think it may have been as early as January. There was a doctor in Haskell County, Kansas, who was reporting an unusually high number of victims to a very virulent form of influenza that was killing people more rapidly than the seasonal flu. And from there, we think that it spread, we know that it spread to an army base nearby. And as a result of that, because of the conditions, it spread rapidly throughout the country. But in any case, that's what happened, is that we think that it spread from that location in Haskell County, which was a pig farming area in a flyover area for migratory waterfowl. The influenza is a zoonotic avian infection that was transferred from birds into water. It's how their digestive system may have mixed with human viruses in the pigs and then transferred to human beings. But no one is sure of that yet. It may have, other theories exist, but that's the best guess. From there, it spread to an army base in Kansas. And as a result of that, it, with the troops, spread all over the United States and then eventually the world.
So why do we refer to it as the Spanish flu?
That's an interesting story because it illustrates how misleading the whole issue of naming really is. During World War I, all the belligerents practiced censorship. They did not allow news that was considered bad for morale to be printed. Print was, of course, really the only media available. So they did not allow alarming stories about the influenza pandemic to spread. Spain was neutral; they weren't restricted, so their journalists reported what seemed an unusually high number of cases. So logically, but erroneously, people called it the Spanish flu, even though today, whatever they disagree on, everybody who studies this agrees it did not begin in Spain.
And it didn't, it was really pretty much neutral in terms of people that caught this. It was not really segregated in society. Do you have a chart?
That's an interesting sort of thing to consider, and that is that today we know the coronavirus is opening up wide fissures in American society, or to be more precise, it's revealing the fissures that are already there. Um, so, for example, it's adversely affecting African Americans and Latinx people, the working poor, and so on, both because of comorbidities, but also because they're more likely to have to work in essential industries and whatnot. That didn't happen in 1918 to 19. It was an equal opportunity killer. It struck everybody. The one thing that was striking is that the pattern of lethality was very, very different. If you look at what I'm sharing now, the graph of what would be a normal flu virus, which is the one in green, happens to be the 1928 to 29 one. That shows the normal pattern, a high mortality rate among kids under the age of 5 because they just don't have very strong resistance to anything. And then, gradually increasing and taking off dramatically with older people around age 60. In the case of the 1918 pandemic, you get the infamous W pattern. Yes, it hit the young hard, and it did kill the elderly, but it also showed an alarming and hard to explain spike in the middle age groups, people with otherwise healthy young people with strong immune systems. And of course, we later learned that it was precisely those strong immune systems that were killing them.
What do you mean?
Well, the way the virus operates is that people die from it from one of two ways. The virus attacks, first of all, it's a deep lung infection as well as an upper respiratory one. So it spreads quickly like a normal influenza, but unlike normal influenza, it settles deep in the lung and attacks the lung cells. The body responds by flooding antibodies in, which release, in fact, a protein called a cytokine. We're talking about a cytokine storm. You get an attack on the infected cells, and the detritus and the fluid from that kind of battle in the lungs, for lack of a better term, builds up and oxygen cannot get through to the cells. The younger and healthy you are, the more aggressive your immune system, the more aggressively it attacks that. Now, the death among the older people often occurred a few weeks after the initial infection from an opportunistic pneumonic bacteria, which was still what often causes problems for most influenza people. If you get an annual, let's say you get a sinus infection with flu, it's a viral thing. Antibiotics don't do very well. You may fight it off, and then all of a sudden you're still sick. And a couple of weeks later, you go to the doctor and say, okay, you now got a secondary viral or bacterial infection. We'll treat that with antibiotics. They didn't have the antibiotics. There wasn't much they could do.
Well, and of course, the medical system was certainly not as sophisticated as it is today. But do we know if they had a sense kind of in real time what they were dealing with?
Actually, they had more of one than we give them credit for. By the end of the 19th century, what is the germ theory of infection had replaced the old miasma theory, which was that noxious odors produced infection. Sometimes it worked. I mean, cholera is spread through even sewage. So, of course, if you get rid of that by having adequate drainage, the smell goes away, so does the disease. However, that doesn't work for airborne infections and so on. So they knew about the bacillus that caused pneumonia. They even had some limited ability to treat that. They had only a rudimentary understanding of viruses, and of course they couldn't detect them until much later. So there just wasn't very much anybody could do. You could treat the symptoms, and the best thing was quarantine and bed rest. And then, of course, interestingly enough, the bed rest, not only after you get better, but stay in bed long after you get better until you're actually fully recovered, which they're advising people to do today.
And of course, that's very difficult today. I'm sure it certainly was then too.
Yes.
What role did World War One play in the transmission of the disease?
World War I was absolutely critical in the transmission of the disease. The United States entered in April of 1917. We had a tiny army, a garrison army, a frontier army, with some stationed overseas in places like the Philippines and whatnot. So to ramp up for war, we instituted a draft, and we also ramped up war industries. We've been supplying the French and the British since 1914, but we increased dramatically. That had two very negative effects in terms of the pandemic. One, you draft people, you quickly get them into training camps that are nowhere near capable of handling them. There's overcrowding. Barrack room conditions are ideal to spread a disease, especially when you don't understand transmission adequately. And civilians crowded into the cities. Some of them, the beginning of what later came to be called the Great Migration of African Americans from the South, looking to work in factories in the North for better opportunity. And again, they moved into cities, lived in slums, had very little access to, to clean drinking water, sanitation, or even adequate housing. And so this was perfect. And the other thing was, because of the war and the censorship, there was a refusal to admit there was a problem. And you get trained in one location, you get shipped somewhere else, you move people all over the country, you are creating the perfect transfer mechanism, put them on crowded troop ships, send them to Europe where they infect Europeans. And then when the war ends, all of those people are transported back home and you get a global infection, a global pandemic.
So again, just so I have this, my history straight, help me to understand, when did this migration happen in relation to when the flu actually broke out?
The flu broke out, the first recorded case in Kansas in an army base on March 4th of 1918. It was a mild version. That's the thing too. Flu comes in waves. And the first wave was relatively mild. It didn't look terribly much different from a seasonal flu, ended around early summer. Meanwhile, we were moving these people all over. And then it mutated, as near as we can tell. It came back like gangbusters in September, produced the deadliest wave of the 675,000 Americans estimated to have died. 2/3 of them died between September and the end of December 1918.
Dr. Mockaitis, they didn't have social media then. So how were they tracking that number, and how aware was American citizens about kind of this catastrophic impact that this virus was having?
Well, ironically, the one group that did actually do some tracking and some effective quarantine was, again, the Army, because they were concerned about the effectiveness of getting fighting forces to Europe. So we get some accounting there as well. But we have the same problem in that in the cities, of course, there wasn't a clear flow of information. The government, there was no coordinated national response. Local governments also were not anxious to play this up. So with censorship and the war effort, there was an underreporting, there were false reassurances, oh, don't worry, it's nothing serious, etc. But in the absence of information, panic and rumor fill in. And when you have the numbers of people dying in places like Philadelphia, there simply is no way to deny something terrible is going on. And then they start putting in measures we're familiar with. And you'd be arrested for spitting on the sidewalk, for example. But they did use masks. They did ban gatherings. They banned funerals. They closed all kinds of concert halls and bars, saloons, restaurants, and told people to avoid crowds and to cover when they sneeze. It's amazing how similar the advice was.
It's remarkable.
Yeah, absolutely.
And what about, you mentioned a second wave? Was there a third wave?
There was a third wave in early 1920 coming, kind of rebounding back out of Australia. In terms of the lethality, it was as bad as the one in the fall, but the big advantage is that the war ends in November of 1918, and by the winter of 1919, there just isn't as much movement of these people around, so it petered out. The other thing that was kicking in, and this is how ultimately the whole infection peters out, is the herd immunity is starting to have some effect. So many people get sick that the disease can't easily be transferred. The human fuel, for lack of a better term, is being used up. And then the other thing is that over time, the virus again mutates into mild influenza.
So I'm really curious to understand how the medical community was, was really dealing um, with with the virus, and specifically, again, a little bit more about the advice that they were giving the public.
Well, the advice, the Surgeon General, as I said, put out the same kind of warning you would expect today. As far as, the best advice they could give, and of course the medical profession is incredibly uneven in terms of quality and ability. And sadly, the military had scooped up a lot of the best doctors. And more critically, there was a shortage of nurses. In any kind of pandemic, there's a certain number of people who would survive if you just help them to keep them hydrated, and help take care of their bodily functions. And with the absence of nurses, a lot of people died who wouldn't be because nobody was there to really care for them.
Right, right. And then what about, today there, unfortunately, we're a divided nation, and the Republicans seem to view things one way, the Democrats view things a different way. What was the public response 100 years ago?
Public response was quite similar. John Barry, who's probably written the best book on this, basically said, and I think it's absolutely true, crises don't bring out the best or the worst in us, they reveal who we really are. So those people who were likely to be generous and to volunteer did in fact step up, and they helped their neighbors, but many more didn't. And there sadly were kids, because this hit the parents and them, who died of neglect because nobody would go to the houses to feed and care for them and so on. But to give you an illustration of how much a local response can make a huge difference, look at this graph, which is comparing Philadelphia and St. Louis. The Philadelphia, the virus hits there around the 17th of September. There is a huge Liberty Bond, war bond parade scheduled for the 28th. The medical professionals are saying, don't hold this event, shut the city down. They didn't listen, the morale thing, it's the war effort above all else. So the beginning, about 3 days later, the massive outbreak, and it's only then that they take things seriously. And look at the spike in terms of numbers of deaths per 100,000. You can see it on the screen here. Compare that to St. Louis, that has an outbreak in early October, and 2 days later closes schools, dance halls, music halls, saloons, and does what we would call social distancing, and you can see how much they flatten their curves. But the thing is, people were, thrown onto the devices of themselves and their local communities. There just wasn't a coordinated. Woodrow Wilson, the president, absolutely never spoke about the pandemic. It was truly amazing. And it was, you're on your own kind of thing. And at this point in time, it wasn't even a state level. That capability wasn't really there. It was literally city and town by city and town.
Was there a public backlash, on the other side of it?
No, not in the sense that you're thinking now, where people are resisting distancing measures, refusing to wear masks and so on. An unfortunate blip that came on because I hadn't closed the window was a young man being expelled from a Walmart because Costco, sorry, because he refused to put on a mask. That was a nice illustration, even if it was an error. But that didn't happen, as near as we can tell, because this hit so hard and so rapidly within a 3-month period. People went the opposite extreme and were incredibly panicked. In some towns, you actually had armed guards stopping people getting off the train, telling people, if you get off the train, we're going to forcibly quarantine you for 2 weeks or something.
Really?
And literally closing off their entire communities, as opposed to that. There's a lot of decent citizen activity. And in Philadelphia, again, you look at people like Sean Penn and Oprah Winfrey stepping up to provide help. That also happened. They funded, hiring nurses and things of that nature. So it's an interesting kind of parallel in terms of the response then as now. I wish I could say we learned from the past, but in this case, it's not clear that we really have.
It's remarkable. How did the pandemic actually end?
Well, as I said, it didn't come to an abrupt halt. It sort of petered out. I described 3 waves unfolding over a period of a year, about 18 months. But there were minor waves that continued on into the, through 1920 and 21. But as I said, herd immunity, enough people got sick and got better that the resistance was there and the disease just didn't have any fuel. And then the disease mutated. We think it went to a milder form, and eventually it just, the disease just kind of withered away.
So I want to remind the audience that there is a question and answer button at the bottom of your screen. So please do submit any questions. And we've touched on this throughout our conversation, Doctor, but can you just kind of again list what you think are the biggest lessons that we should learn from 100 years ago to be applying today?
Okay, the biggest lessons are number one, there is no substitute for good information, even if the information is not particularly reassuring. Fear, rumor, and ignorance will fill a vacuum. And that is always worse than clear information. So, the steady, reliable stream, and to be fair, I think the governor of Illinois is doing a good job with that. And people don't always like to hear it, but there's no there's no information back here. There's disagreement, there's argument, but there isn't that gap. Second of all, there is really no substitute for a coordinated, effective national strategy. A lot of lives could have been saved and can be saved if, in fact, there's a coordinated, directed effort from the center rather than a "you're on your own, everybody" kind of an attitude, which sadly, again, I'm seeing too much of that going on today. And then, I guess in a final way, no historian will ever say history repeats itself, because it doesn't. But it is somewhat reassuring to realize we've been through worse times and managed to come out successfully at the end of it.
Well, and to one of your points, I just saw on the news today that they were saying that there's some data sets that show if we had responded earlier, that we may have been able to avoid, close to 1/3 of the deaths, 32,000 deaths they think could have been saved if we had responded differently early on.
Yeah, I want to be really clear here. I'm a historian, not an epidemiologist or a medical doctor, so I can't speak to the validity of the numbers, but I think virtually everybody who's looked at it has said an earlier response would be crucial. And look at the graph I showed you of St. Louis versus Philadelphia. That was with rudimentary understanding, but just isolation, quarantining, and social distancing had an immediate and dramatic effect. There's no question if we'd done that earlier, that we would have saved lives.
We do have a question from the audience, and it reads, how did the economy react to the 1918 pandemic?
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything we can learn from that reaction?
Yeah, the immediate reaction was it did have a very negative effect. Absenteeism in some factories and so on rose almost to 50%, in some cases a little bit higher. And there were severe interruptions, even more so than we would have today, of food, coal, which was the primary heating fuel at the time, and other necessities. So there was an effect. It was pretty much quickly absorbed, I think, in the 1920s as a result of prosperity coming back before the great stock market crash. What's kind of amazing to me as I look at this is how little impact on historical memory the pandemic actually had. All the great novelists of the interwar period, Hemingway, Fitzgerald, Dos Passos, people like that, they hardly touch it at all. And it just became the forgotten outbreak. It killed more people than World War I, and yet it did not have the emotional impact. It ironically has only become of interest now that we're in the middle of something similar.
We have a second audience question, and it reads, did the medical practitioners of the time use the old, quote, transfuse platelets to build immunity or treat the disease?
No, they didn't have a sophisticated understanding enough to do that. They had a variety of methods, that some of which worked, some didn't. They could treat. They had some ability with the vaccine, and I can't give the technical details, to treat or to do some prevention of pneumonia. But in terms of isolating platelets, transfusing them, no, that was not done. They had a bizarre idea in some cases that high doses of aspirin would help. That would knock a fever down to some degree, perhaps, but it also created aspirin poisoning, which in some cases was serious. And they also had their, crazy responses we've had. Instead of bleach, they, in some cases, injected hydrogen peroxide.
Oh, boy.
Equally bad results. So, I mean, they really, at that time, there really just was no good way. Isolation, hydration worked particularly well if the person, but it ultimately was on the person's immune system to fight it off. If you could care for those who had the strength to do it, you could help them get through it. And it was the breakdown of that care that was one of the real tragedies.
Well, it's hard to believe, but our 30 minutes has come to pass, and this has been a very enlightening conversation. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for sharing history. And thank you for reminding us that there's a lot that we should learn from 100 years ago and would benefit us to implement maybe some better strategies. So Dr. Mockaitis, thank you. And to our audience, thank you for joining us for today's episode. Please watch your emails for updates on when we will meet again. We wish everybody a wonderful upcoming holiday weekend. Stay well and stay strong. Thank you.
Behave well and observe social distancing. And wear a mask.
Observe social distancing and wear a mask. Have a great day, Doctor. Thank you so much, Professor. Bye, everybody. Stay well.